Today, I'm going to review the stages of psychological transformation in Jung's vision seminars. So, the vision seminars were written down after Jung's lectures in the 1930s related to psychological material and artistic representations of that material by Christiana Morgan. It's a book, it's in two volumes that record Jung's interpretations of this material. And so today we're going to talk about the meaning of those interpretations when taken together. So the book goes into extensive detail, interpreting as Jung does the content of the material with all kinds of other cultural symbols in order to try to derive their meaning. Today, we won't go into that much detail about sort of the cultural associations, but we'll try to read these visions together, using them as primary material, read them together with the interpretations, try to understand, what is the meaning of the book and what is the meaning of the relationship between Morgan and Jung. So one thing we'll talk through is, the relationship is framed as analyst and analysand, which to some extent tends to privilege Jung vis-a-vis Morgan, to the extent that one tends to go to an analyst with some type of difficulty in life functioning, and the analyst provides some service for the resolution of that psychological difficulty. I think this needs to be understood differently. I think both Jung and Morgan were professionals in their own right. Morgan, to a significant extent, not acknowledged as such, but I think the substance of her materials elevate her to something more than an analyst, and I think she's genuinely contributing to our understanding of psychology with what she did. Okay, so let's do a little bit of historical background and tell you a little bit more about who Christiana Morgan was. Christiana Morgan was born in Boston to a upper class family. Her father was a professor, and they had money relative to Boston in the 1930s, but they didn't have family money. Um, Her adolescence was markedly difficult, in part due to social pressures to conform to feminine stereotypes. She formed a relationship with a man who went off to fight in World War One. This was in her early 20s. At that time, she began training and practicing as a nurse. So during World War One, there was a lot of fighting, and she went to New York to train as a nurse. During her childhood and into this period, Morgan spent a great deal of time recording highly analytical observations about herself and her life in her journal. And she also has detailed correspondences with her husband, who was on the front lines, where he experienced the brutalities and terror of war. He was really in the thick of it in terms of fighting, and he would later die from a disease that he got on the front lines. So this and other material have allowed Claire Douglas. Claire Douglas is a modern writer to write an extensive biography of Morgan, including a detailed recounting of Morgan's familial line back to the founding American Puritans. So let me just say before I go on, Claire Douglas was a wife of J.D. Salinger, who wrote this biography of Morgan, and it's excellent biography. I think one thing to say, some of the kind of later scholars of Morgan. So this was in the 90s. Some of the stuff more recently published have kind of called into question whether or not Douglas was there was transference between Douglas and Morgan, to the extent that, did Douglas read Morgan the way that she read her own relationship with Salinger, and so that's kind of part of the controversy. But so anyway, she wrote this biography including kind of Morgan's ancestry, which include American Puritans, including those who had infamously violent relationships with Native peoples, both as the victim and the victimizer. So this will come into play. We'll see how these historical relationships show up in the visions. After the war, after World War One, she and her husband formed a small circle of friends in Boston, and she and another man during that time would read Melville and Jung together. The group So Morgan, her husband, and her friend and his wife moved to the UK together, I think, to attend graduate school, I think Oxford or Cambridge. And this man, uh, who's Charles Murray, who she would later have significant psychological, who would significant professional collaboration with, visited Jung, and soon after, Christiana also visited Jung in Zurich. And so this presentation is about Morgan's relationship with Jung. Okay, so we're going to talk through, and I've got here. One thing to also sort of mention her relationship with Murray. So Morgan's husband died uh, maybe 10 years after the war, and she was unmarried the rest of her life. But she developed this relationship with Charles Murray, who was a famous Harvard psychologist, who went on to develop the thematic apperception test, is also mired in controversy for other reasons. Uh, but her husband died, and then Murray's wife dies much later in life. They were both quite old. And Morgan had hoped, this is what's kind of thought by even some of Morgan's own family, that she and Murray would get married after his wife died. And they didn't. So Murray marries another woman. Morgan is, this is the theory, hurt by that. And she took her own life. And so before she died, what was on her desk was this poem by Conrad Aiken. And so that's why I have it here. So I think one thing I should mention, I'll make these slides available to anybody that wants them. There's going to be a lot of material on the slides that I'm not going to be able to get to. But I've tried to write the slides so that if you want to read them later, they should read sort of as, like an article or something, so you can read through it. Okay, so we're going to talk through a number of Morgan's visions and dreams. And so I want to say something about, and we're going to talk a bit about, I'm not going to be too explicit in the way Jung interprets them, but of course my interpretation of the visions are based on Jung's. So let me just say something about the manner of interpretation. So how does an analytical psychologist interpret dreams and visions? And it comes down to this subjective method. So the subjective method, or interpretation on the subjective level, is the idea that in dreams and visions, and you'll be familiar with this, in dreams and visions, the objects or people in those dreams and visions don't, within the confines of this method, refer to their actual referent in the outer world, but are representations of psychological dynamics within the individual. So Jung says all contents of dreams are treated as symbols for subjective contents. So if I have a dream of, let's say I meet somebody on the street and I dream of them later that night, um, according to the subjective method, I'm not dreaming about that person. I'm dreaming about the part of my psyche which that person represents. Okay. So one other thing I want to put into the mix here is how would we use the subjective method in the particular case of Christiana Morgan? And one way I think we can think about this is by using some materials written down by Tony Wolff in a very small article called Structural Forms of the Feminine Psyche. There she lays out four sort of, you might say, archetypes of feminine psychology, one of which I think is particularly relevant for today, which is the so-called medial structural form. So medial meaning medium. So we know what a medium is. It's somebody, in present day, we think of somebody on TV who, is in a studio with an audience, and this medium channels dead people. That somebody in the audience, somebody recently died, and the medium channels that dead person to that person in the audience. That's one way to think about it. I think, let me just read what Tony Wolff says. She says, the lucidity of consciousness rests upon dark unconscious seeds out of which have grown and will grow objective cultural values. So all she's saying is there's an unconscious, there's a conscious attitude, and it's the sort of dark unconscious from which ideas emerge. It is this unconscious background which is perceived by the medial structural form. So the idea is there is a archetype in the feminine psyche that is able to sort of intuit uh, unconscious contents, things that people don't aren't aware of. Let me say one more thing about this because I think it's particularly relevant not just to Morgan and to visions, but Morgan's relationship with Jung in particular. Wolf goes on to say, uh, the medium's ability to do this may at first be inspiring to others, and in particular for the man. So when a woman is in a relationship with a man, this is the idea of the book or the article. She's able to intuit the cycle, what is unconscious in the man. And since the medial woman who senses the archetypal foundations of his spirit will activate, and she may even represent them to him. So part of what I want to suggest is, it's often said that Morgan has these visions that Jung interprets, and so Jung is bringing, the major contribution here is uh, Jung is bringing psychological interpretation to otherwise sort of unstructured, chaotic, and meaningless visions of Morgan. And I think this interpretation renders Morgan sort of inanimate. So Morgan is having these visions, and Morgan herself is not contributing. Morgan is seen as this sort of force of nature, almost an animal, who is being objectively studied by this, brilliant scientist Jung. I think what this suggests is that there is a possibility that what Morgan is actually contributing here is not she's not just this sort of inanimate thing that is having these psychological, the psychological material is just sort of emerging from. But Morgan herself, what I'm suggesting, is intuiting Jung's unconscious and then doing art that represents Jung's unconscious back to him. And so if this is true, this is a profound contribution by Morgan, who was able to uh, put structure to what was even unconscious in Jung, right? So if we think of Jung in his work as him bringing consciousness to his own unconscious, then Morgan is doing the same thing that Jung did, which is reading Jung's unconscious and representing it to him. Of course, we can't really say. There's always the sort of alchemical confusion that happens in the collaboration between two individuals and the analytic dyad, to the extent that um, we don't know how much of this is Jung and how much of this is Morgan. But I want to make sure to have said this because I think Morgan contributes profoundly to this relationship and to this book. Okay, so if this is true and Morgan is intuiting Jung's unconscious, let's look at Jung's own writings to see how his interpretations in these visions map onto his work. And of course, there's two things going on. One is Morgan might be having visions that represent Jung's unconscious. The other might be that the lens that we're provided to interpret Morgan's visions are just Jung using his work to interpret her visions. So in either case, right, I want to say that these visions represent psychological transformation. Whatever the case may be, we can use Jung's own work to understand the importance of these visions. And so I think these visions break down into four categories, and I'll talk about those categories more later. But the idea is these visions and their artistic representation represent this transformation process that goes through three stages, four if you include the starting phase. So I think that they represent sort of the human predicament. So, what is the psychological predicament of the individual who is not yet conscious of themselves? The first stage of psychological transformation, which is alchemically the union with the mind or the unio mentalis. The second stage is union with the body. And then the third stage is union with the transcendent. And the idea is that going through these steps, one moves from a predicament into some form of stable conscious life. So I won't go through this in too much detail. We're going to go through this. The entirety of today's talk is going to go through each of these. So I'm not going to cover them too much here. We'll get to them later. Okay, so let's look through. This will become more important later, but let me just give you some sense of kind of the chronology of Jung and Morgan's collaboration. Morgan goes to Zurich in June of 1926 and begins analysis with Jung. She has a first vision in July. The entirety of what we're going to cover today is highlighted here. It's from July 8th through July 19th. And I've put the representative visions uh, next to that. And if you want to go through the source material, of course, I've tried to give you some clues here. After these visions, Morgan leaves Zurich for a time and comes back after holiday, and then she eventually leaves around November. She's done. So the analysis takes maybe 3 months total. After she leaves, she ends up sending Jung a bunch of other materials. Jung writes back to her. This is important biographically. I won't get into it here. And then in 1930, Jung begins the Vision Seminar. So we're talking about a 5-year period. The Vision Seminars last 3 or 4 years. And so we're talking about maybe 10 years all in. So then let's look at some detail of the seminars. So I've got on the left here, the seminars are basically contemporaneous notes, uh, basically verbatim of what Jung said and what the participants said in the seminar setting. It's written down and published in 2 volumes. Today we're going to look at just the first volume, and we're actually going to just look at 2 terms within uh, the first volume. And so each term has like 5 or 6 lectures. And so today we're going to consider like maybe 10 or 15 lectures total. Within these lectures, there's a number of visions. There's no really like objective way necessarily to divide the visions up. I mean, Christiana obviously has the visions in sort of these, she'll have one day, one the next. Uh, each like vision session of hers might include 1 or 2 visions that are kind of you can group. And what I've done is I've grouped them even smaller into like bite-sized pieces so that we can interpret each. And so these are just rough groupings of these bite-sized pieces of visions. Uh, I've mapped each of them onto the stages that I just talked about in the last slide. The human predicament, for example, I think we can represent with 6 dreams. This first stage, the unio mentalis, is a series of 11 visions. Uh, third stage is 11 more, and then the fourth is 12. So today we're going to talk about 40. They're not 40 visions, so it's not like a ton of work that we're going to go through today, but it's a lot of material. And there's going to be 40 that we're going to dive into. And then sort of along the way, I'm going to give a lot. I'll talk a lot because it's a lot to get through, but after each group, I want to give time. Hopefully we have time today. After each group of 10 or so visions or dreams, I want to give you just maybe 5 minutes to work with the material. And then if anybody wants to say what came out of their work, we'll do maybe 5 minutes of conversation. So hopefully we'll do like 30 minutes of work together, in between me sort of just lecturing at you. And then I'll try to leave questions at the end, maybe a half hour if we have time. Okay. So now I'm going to jump into the first series of dreams.